Hey everyone, so welcome to today's session. So as the group pointed out, my name is Nick Randolph, and I'm hollering from down under. So I'm based in Sydney, Australia, and I run a technology company called Built to Roam, where we sort of specialize in mobile and cross-platform applications, which kind of leads me on to the topic of today, which is about the Uno platform. And for those who don't know about the Uno platform, it is basically a cross-platform .NET solution for building applications for pretty much any platform where .NET will run. And so, the tagline is WinUI everywhere, and we'll get into the details of what WinUI is and its sort of history and evolution. But the idea is that we can take an application that we've written and run it across various platforms. If you need to get hold of me or want to get hold of me after the session, the Twitter handle is probably the easiest place to start. I'm also on sort of LinkedIn and email, etc. as well. But definitely happy to take questions and provide assistance on getting started with the Uno platform if you want to follow up after the session. So before we jump in and talk about the details of the Uno platform, let's actually just take a back step and just talk about the sort of the problem domain and I guess what the challenges is that we're trying to sort out with the platform. It's not a new domain. Cross-platform as a concept has been around for quite some time. Definitely as companies invested in sort of iOS and Android applications, there's definitely a recognition that there's a challenge associated with building things multiple times for multiple platforms, both from a cost perspective, so having to sort of formulate two teams that are going to build the same application multiple times. There's obviously a cost associated with that because you've got to maintain the teams, but then actually the wider problem is actually about consistency and how you then structure the ongoing feature development, because you might have one platform that leads, so you might do your iOS application first, but then you're going to get customers on the other platforms that then say, oh, why don't we have this feature? Or you try to get all of the platforms to stay in sync, and then you have a management problem around releases, and everything becomes very timely and costly to try and keep in sync. And then you have things like bugs and stuff like that, and how you address those and prioritization across the various platforms. So it's not a trivial thing to build the same thing multiple times. Obviously, if we could then build something once and have it just work across those platforms, we're sort of negating a lot of those additional costs and additional consistency challenges that we would face. The second part
Sorry, real quick. Are you meaning to be sharing a screen right now?
My apologies. Yes, I am. Thank you for calling me up on that.
No worries.
Let's actually just backstep a little bit. Okay, so can you see that okay?
Yep.
Okay. So just so that you didn't see my contact details, my @ Nick Randolph is the easiest place to get hold of me on Twitter. And as I mentioned, you can get hold of me on the other platforms as well. But yeah, tagline is WinUI everywhere. And the idea is that we're going to have this application that runs across various platforms. So as I was just sort of concluding, we're just talking about the concept of building cross-platform and the challenges associated both from a cost and consistency perspective there. The second sort of challenge is that quite often we'll have legacy applications. So those might be Windows Forms or WPF, or even an existing sort of web application that you want to take across various platforms. And there may be a good reason for taking what is a web application that could just scale down to a device and repurposing it as a native application. It may be performance, it may be usability. You may want to take some advantage of the device capabilities. There's various reasons why you would want to necessarily step down from a web application to a native application, or to bring forward a Windows Forms or a WPF or some other legacy application and actually bring it forward so that it can be pushed out across various device types. So that's quite often, one of the challenges we see in the market, and particularly .NET-based applications. It's good to have a technology where we can bring forward as much of that code as possible without having to rewrite a majority of it. And then the last segment is really around skills and development of the team. And as I mentioned before, having to build an application across multiple platforms typically requires you to have teams that are specific for those platforms. So you might have a Windows team and an iOS team and an Android team. And that's not only a cost problem, but it also is a sort of a training and ongoing development problem, because you've got to provide a career path line for the people in those teams. And so trying to find good resources and maintaining those resources becomes a challenge as well. Whereas if we could build with a single technology stack, we can basically hire for that particular technology. And then, sometimes we may need to deep dive into the platform specifics, but those can either be brought as contract roles or short-term resources just to address those particular platform issues. Okay, so now we get into the Uno platform and sort of the usual sort of stack diagram which associates with these things. But the idea here is that we're building on top of the native capabilities of the various platforms to deliver an abstraction that allows you to build an application once and have it run across whatever devices types you want to run. Now, one of the unique things about the Uno platform is that it doesn't provide an abstraction for the Windows platform. So if you look at other competing technologies like XAML and Forms or Maui, they typically provide an abstraction across every platform. And so you have a single sort of abstraction that is uniform to those. In the case of Uno, they've actually taken the Windows platform as being this almost like the specification. So they don't need to provide an extra layer across the window in the Windows space. But what you see is that you can then take your UWP or your Windows UI application and actually have it running across these various different platforms using the Uno platform. The other thing to point out is that the approach that Uno has taken is that they want to make sure that your application is pixel perfect no matter what platform you're targeting. So an application that's running on Windows should look exactly the same as the application running on iOS and Android. And that's an important distinction, particularly when you look at competing technologies like XAML Forms or Maui, where they use the underlying look and feel of the controls and then allow you to style it from there. And so you actually end up with applications that look subtly different on the various platforms based on the style of the controls that are available on those platforms. The Uno platform is a single code base. That does mean that you do have some platform specific code, but the majority of the code is, it's a single set of XAML files and C# files that make up the entire thing. Being in the .NET space, we are able to leverage the third-party ecosystem that's available in .NET, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then the Uno platform is really now starting to build out further capabilities to put the platform back in platform to basically make it a more productive environment to work in. So, things like tools to help designers bring the design into XAML, additional, plugins and toolbox and controls and stuff like that, which we'll touch on in the second half of the presentation. The idea there is that, the underlying framework is great, but what we really need is the ability to rapidly build out applications on top of the platform. So I mentioned a little bit before about the rendering capabilities and how the approaches that the Uno platform has taken. And if we look at the cross-platform space as a whole, we see that there are a couple of different options in terms that different platforms have taken. So on the right-hand side here, we see that there's the options around native rendering. By this, we're basically saying that the platforms or the technology is taking advantage of the controls that the underlying platform make available. So the two here that often are talked about are React Native and XAML Forms, which is now .NET Maui. And so they leverage the native platform controls to actually render the look and feel of the application. On the flip side, we have what we refer to as canvas rendering technologies. And so the two here are Avalonia and Flutter, which is not a .NET technology, but probably one of the leading in this kind of space. And their approach is very much that they treat the device as an open canvas, and they're responsible for painting every pixel. This kind of brings with it its own share of problems. Particularly because you're having to write everything, you're doing everything, you are responsible for everything, which means that anything to do with accessibility, input, you're all responsible for that as a platform. Whereas when you take advantage of the native rendering, you get those built into the platform. And so things like screen readers just work automatically, whereas for canvas rendering, you're responsible for integrating with those technologies as part of the implementation. So the Uno platform kind of fits in the middle. It does take advantage of the native rendering controls. However, they are restyled to make sure that they look pixel perfect across the various platforms. There are also some targets that take advantage of canvas rendering. So we use a skier canvas to render for certain platforms. So for example, the WPF platform, which allows you to create an application that's going to work from Windows 7 upwards, uses a skier rendering as opposed to using the WPF backend. One of the big things about the Uno platform is that it does have this concept of lookless or control templating. And the idea there is that for your various controls, whether it be a button or a drop down or whatever, you may want to be able to restyle it without actually changing the functionality of the control. And so this includes things like the animations and the different visual states that a control might have. All of those are able to be customized through the XAML control templating. So the idea is that the control is less dependent on how it looks and that you can restyle it to suit your brand. Okay, here's an example of just a small snippet of XAML and showing you how it could potentially render across various platforms. And as you can see, the slide's getting a little packed here, just due to the number of platforms that the Uno platform supports. So let's actually see a little bit of this in action. And for that, we'll switch across and do a quick demo. So we're going to get started with a new application. Now I could do this a couple of ways. In Visual Studio, there's a Visual Studio extension which you can go to get from the marketplace for Uno, and that comes with a set of templates for Uno. Alternatively, there are some .NET New templates. So if you go to Nougat, you can look up Uno templates. You'll see that there's a .NET New package that you can install that gives you some .NET New templates. And so here we're actually going to start in .NET in the command line. And the reason for that is I actually want to walk through and show you just some of the capabilities of VS Code. And then later on, we'll actually look at creating something and then running it in Visual Studio. Okay, so we're going to run using the sort of vanilla template, which is called Uno app. This generates a Net6 plus WinUI head. Let's just go ahead and create it. I'll walk you through the project structure, and I guess talk a little bit more about UWP versus WinUI and the sort of the backstory there. The only other thing to note here is that I put the VS Code parameter on the end of here. All this does is actually generates the launch JSON file. That means that you don't have to go and set up all of that stuff for actually debugging in VS Code. If you're planning on using this in Visual Studio, you don't need that. But we'll add it for the time being so we can walk through VS Code. Okay, let's go ahead and create that. So this will create our solution. It'll do a basic restore on our solution. And then we should be able to launch code to actually view the project. When you're working with the Uno platform in VS Code, there is also a VS Code extension, which I'd highly recommend. And that just gives you, again, better debugging support. It also gives you hot reload and IntelliSense and things like that. Okay, so let's click the restore button. So again, that's going to go and do .NET Restore. From the bottom left here, we're going to change from being just the solution to actually the WASM target to support debugging there. Okay, so hang on, what do we mean by targets? Okay, so over here, you'll see that our project structure or solution structure is made up of a number of projects. Each of these projects essentially relates to a target platform that we're going to build and run our application on. So you've got things like Windows, you've got WASM for the web, you've got a WPF backend, and then you've got two for essentially skier backends that support Linux. So you've got GTK and the frame buffer. So basically those are just two different options for running on Linux. And then you've got this mobile head. With the evolution of Net6 mobile, we now have a single project that supports iOS, Android, and Mac Catalyst. And so if you're looking at a MAUI project, that's structured very similarly. It's a single project that allows you, is multi-targeted, so you can actually switch which platform you want to deploy and debug your application with. And I mentioned before that we're targeting Windows UI here. And so the evolution here is that Microsoft started with the Windows platform being UWP, so the Universal Windows Platform. And recently that's evolved as they've detached the XAML and the application framework from Windows and sort of decoupled it. We now have this concept of WinUI and the Windows App SDK. And so that's the latest way of building for Windows. And so Uno's taken advantage of that. So there's got kind of like two different flavors of Uno now. There is one that targets UWP and is compatible with that. But then the new version is now targeting Windows UI. And that's the version we're using here. So going forward, the standard is WinUI plus Net6. So all of these target platforms are targeting a form of Net6. Okay, so the crux of our application is actually this shared project, and this is where we see the most of our application files. So here you can see our app.xaml and xaml.cs. If you've worked with XAML before, you'll be kind of familiar with this sort of construct. So rather than having like a program main as an entry point, we have our app.xaml, which is essentially our application. It's our entry point. And in here, you'll see that there are things like on launch, which is like one of the callback methods that gets invoked when the application launches. So I'm actually going to put a breakpoint there. So when we run our application, it'll actually hit that. And then we've got our main page. So basically you can think of this as the first page of your application. And so, you know, as we start to build out our application, we're probably likely to create more pages that we can then navigate through. So we're going to go ahead and run our application. So we've already selected WASM as the target platform, and I'll press F5 to basically kick that off. And what you should see in the debug console is that it's going to be called .NET Run, and it takes a couple of seconds, but then you should see that it starts to say, okay, well, I'm now listening on a certain port, and our application is now loading in the browser. You'll see that our breakpoint does get hit, so it is a quite high fidelity debugging environment. So we can actually interrogate variables. We can step through, so I can press F10 to step through like that. We can obviously set and remove breakpoints. I'll go ahead and actually allow this to run so we can actually see how it displays, and it is our Hello World application. So nothing particularly fancy, but one of the interesting things we're going to do is actually come in here, which you're going to modify the contents of our page. So this is the XAML that makes up that page, and we're going to go ahead and actually add in a slider. So give it a name. Type today. Here we go. And what we're going to do is actually data bind the value of that slider to the output or to the text block that we've got here. So we're just going to use a binding expression. So we're going to bind to the value property on the slider, and we need to say that element name equals slider. Okay, so that's our data binding expression. If we switch back to the web browser, we can see that the hot reload has already kicked in. It's updated the browser. And as we drag this cursor along the screen, we can actually see that it updates. Now, obviously, we're not just interested in the web, so we'll switch across to the GTK output and switch debuggers. And we'll kick that off. And what we'll see is that the same code is actually going to run essentially running on Linux. So it's running on WSL and just displaying across the top of our Windows environment. So again, I can drag the cursor here and we've got the same update in the text block there. Okay, so let's just jump back to our slides for a minute. And so a bit of back history on the Uno platform. It's been around for a number of years. So back in 2018, it was open sourced, and that coincided with sort of the version 1. It also coincided with the first version of WebAssembly support. And since then, the team has basically been evolving and doing subsequent releases to support various platform-specific features that have sort of come out over time. So you'll see here things like hot reload were added, a number of new features over the last couple of years to support things like WinUI, Android X, material changes, And with last year, the team released version 4, which is the sort of the first iteration on this sort of the concept of it being more than just a technology stack and being more of a platform. And so things like the Uno extensions were released. There was various updates to the toolkit, and the support for the first iteration of the Figma plugin were all released around that time, and have subsequently been iterated. And so I think we're just about to do a 4.5 release, which is just imminent. And so, this is just incremental updates to these various tools. It is worth noting that the platform is completely open source and available for consumption without any licensing or royalties. There is a paid support model, so if you're concerned that taking dependency on the Uno platform, that you're worried about support and what happens if there are bugs or issues, there is a paid support program. That said, I would comment that the team are very responsive, so a lot of issues that get raised on GitHub are resolved as quickly as possible, because obviously we want to make sure that any blockers for users of the Uno platform get unblocked very quickly. As an open source platform, Microsoft is actually one of the largest open source contributor by virtue of the fact that they've got access to the WinUI source code, and that makes bringing the various controls across to the Uno platform that much easier. And just by way of example, the date time picker has got a substantial amount of reuse that was brought across to support the various target platforms that the Uno platform targets. And one of the interesting things here is it's not just about easing the workload and contributing the source code. It's also important to try for consistency across the various platforms. So the behaviors that are there on Windows, we're trying to replicate and make sure that those are very consistent with the behaviors that you see on iOS and Android and the other target platforms. As I mentioned before, the advantage of being in the .NET ecosystem is that you can take advantage of all of the libraries and innovation that takes place. And so essentially any sort of Net Standard 2 library, and obviously Net 6 library now, as we move into sort of the Net 6 environment, we can take advantage of those as part of a reference in your application. Where there are UI related things, if a third-party control library supports Windows, those can be easily adapted to take advantage of the Uno platform. It's not just a simple matter of just dropping them in and that they'll run. They do need an Uno platform equivalent, but that's relatively easy to generate given that they're compiled against the Uno platform, and the XAML and the code is all consistent. And lastly, there's some presentation frameworks like Prism and Reactive UI that actually support the Uno platform as well. Here's an example of the Info-6 control for the Uno platform. The other sort of call out that I'd make here is live charts. They've got the beta available for the Uno platform that provides some very high fidelity controls, particularly around the graphing and charting space. I'd also make a call out here that the community toolkit, which is being iterated for Windows, the Uno platform does support a version of the community toolkit from Microsoft that's available for all the Uno platform targets. Okay, so the next section we're going to talk about is the sort of the platform part of the Uno platform. And here we're really talking about productivity tools that aim to take you from design all the way through to producing your application. And so we'll actually start in the design space. And quite often the challenge faced by sort of designers and developers is that there seems to be this sort of this void between the two. And so the designers come up with this really nice looking design, very functional in how it works. And they hand it off as often a static file or perhaps a click-through environment to developers. And then developers are responsible for basically recreating the look and feel either in XAML or in code. And this creates a sort of a bit of a handoff problem because it's very error prone because you're having to reproduce the same thing. And just simple things like how controls scale and stuff like that. The designers might have put a lot of thought into that, and then when the developers drop controls on a page, they don't align the same way, or they don't behave the same way because they don't have the same design background as the designers do. And this process is quite expensive as well, because it means that every time you iterate your designs, the developers have got to do a diff on the design and basically use that to update the code and the XAML. On the flip side, if you look at some of the innovations happening in this sort of design to code space, so things like the Power Platform is a good example of this, where you essentially have a 4GL, which allows designers to basically drag and drop things on the screen, and it generates your app from that. And the downside here is that they are very opinionated, and they're often quite rigid in the design and the styling that's available. And so what the Uno platform is looking at doing is providing a middle ground, which allows designers to stay in a tool of choice. So the first cab off the rank is Figma. So it allows designers to stay in a tool that they are familiar with, and yet allows developers to basically generate XAML from that Figma document. So easing the burden of trying to reproduce the look and feel of the application. And so the idea here is that we can shorten the feedback loop, because ideally the XAML that comes from the Figma plugin should have minimal changes as it gets applied into the actual application, making it much more error-free, and just lessening that cycle of trying to update as new designs come through. So there are two parts to the Figma plugin. There's a component library, which allows you to, basically, it's a starting point for building applications. So it has a number of predefined components and controls and themes, and etc. So basically it allows designers to sort of rapidly start building things. And then there's a live plugin, so that basically allows you to view the designs as it would be replicated in an actual running application. The output from this is that it will generate XAML that you can then import into your application. And this should take care of things like navigation, accessibility, localization. Those are all concerns that really belong in that design space. And if we can bring those through as XAML without the developer having to jump in and actually make changes on those, it just lessens that round tripping of design to code. Okay. So there's a small little video here of actually the Figma plugin. So I'll let that run just for a second or two so you can see a bit of an overview of it. So you can see here that you've got the ability to modify some of the styling aspects, so whether it be colors or fonts and logos, etc. You then have ability to basically rapidly generate pages that all sort of match in size and are able to generate XAML for your application. So this part is all common to what designers would be used to, so they can do all of the layout changes that they're familiar with, customize the look and feel of the application. And so then the output of this is going to be the XAML that we're going to import into our application. So I'll just pause the video there, because we're actually going to jump into and actually take a look at the Figma document. The component library that's available actually comes with a sample application. So it's a sample sort of commerce-based application. We'll actually see this in a minute as part of the Figma documentation. Okay, so let's switch across to this environment again. And we're going to pull up Figma, which is here. So this is the Uno Platform Material Toolkit. It is styled for the material design language. And so the idea here is that as we jump into this toolkit, we can see that there's a whole bunch of sort of getting started instructions. I would highly recommend reading through this. It just basically gives you an idea of how to best utilize this component template. But as we step through here, you can see that there are various sort of predefined pages that define things like the themes. So this is essentially anything related to color, typography, icons, images that you're going to use throughout your application can all be defined within this sort of themes page here. We then have components. So this is, here we're really talking about your standard controls that you'll want to use in your application. So if we zoom in here, you can see that we've got our various buttons. And so I'll just zoom in a little bit here. So this is our sort of standard button. But what's interesting here is that it's not just a singular button. We can actually scroll down here. We can see all of the different variants for our button. And so rather than us having to sort of drop a button in and restyle it and calibrate it, what we can do is grab the appropriate variant here and just drop it into our design. And so that just means that it's much easier to build out our application, have an idea of how it's going to look. We've also got preset components, but this is still like larger control components. So we've got things like cards and forms and lists, etc. And then lastly, we've got an example application. So this is basically gives you an idea of how to go about using the Figma file to build out a look and feel of an application. And so we're actually going to use this in a little bit to actually generate some code for our application. So let's just jump back to the slides for a second. So the next thing, part of the platform we talk about is the themes libraries. And so out of the box, because the Uno platform is built from the Windows platform, the standard look and feel for applications is the Fluent design language. Okay, so basically the look and feel of all controls across various devices is based on the Windows design language. So quite often this doesn't really play nicely with where designers want to be, particularly for iOS and Android, and they'll typically want to pick up either an iOS look and feel, so Cupertino, or an Android look and feel, so Material. Those are available as Nougat packages, so you can basically import a theme library to either pick up Cupertino or Material, and it will restyle all of your controls to basically look them like they're designed for iOS or designed for Android in the case of Material. So this again makes it really easy, rather than you having to go and manually restyle every control, to basically have a starting point that looks like the native platform controls. Next thing is the toolkit. So again, because the Uno platform is based on the Windows platform, a lot of the controls or the controls that are available out of the box are all designed for building for desktop or tablet-like experiences. Okay, so they're all full screen or windowed user experience kind of controls. And so when we're building applications that are going to run on mobile devices, quite often we'll need to have additional controls that users would typically expect. So things like a navigation bar at the top. These are available in the toolkit, which again is a Nougat package that's freely available to use of the platform. So here we can see the navigation bar. We've got TabBar at the bottom, and then we've got things like the drawer, which is like a pop-up control, and an auto layout control, which allows us to basically scale things based on design form factor, etc. Next up, we've got the extensions library. So this is taking on a lot of the work that Microsoft have done in the sort of the extension space. So if you're used to building an ASP.NET core application, you'll kind of be a little bit familiar with the concept of extensions and the way that they use that to prime up their dependency injection framework that allows you to basically add services and then access them throughout the running application. What's interesting here is that you'll see that the .NET MAUI team, so the next incarnation of Xamarin Forms, have also followed this sort of approach, and they're taking advantage of using some of the Microsoft extensions to have dependency injection throughout their application. So out of the box, the support with the Uno extensions gives you a dependency injection essentially framework that you can work with. It also supports things like being able to define the hosting environment. So basically, whether you're working in development or production, it handles things like serialization and localization. And two of the sort of major extensions that I'd just like to call out are the navigation extension that basically provides an abstraction for the different types of navigation you see in an application. The Windows platform itself brings to the table essentially a frame-based navigation, so it allows you to step between pages on a frame. But quite often for most applications, that's not sufficient. And because it's all UI driven, it doesn't make it very easy to work with from, say, your view models or your code behind. And so what we'd like to provide in the Uno extensions is basically an abstraction that allows you to deal with not just frame-based navigation, but also things like tabs, message dialogues, etc., all from within your view model space. The next thing is the reactive extensions. And so what we're seeing is a sort of a definite interest in sort of more reactive style programming. So the concept of using MVU, so model view update, as a general pattern, so that you have a set of immutable models that you pass. You basically have update messages that basically just go and generate a new instance of the models, and they are essentially used to update the view. And so this kind of model doesn't actually play very nicely with the data binding model that's inherent in the Windows platform. And so the reactive extensions, which we're not going to spend much time on today, basically provides the glue to actually get the sort of a more MVU style environment working and actually generating the necessary bindings for it to play nicely with data binding. Okay, with that, we're actually going to jump back into code and take a look at a more fully fledged example. So let's just drop Figma out for a second. Just close these. And we're going to come here and we're going to use .NET New. And this time we're going to use the extensions template. So again, this is available by Nougat. If you look up Uno templates, you'll see that there's a separate package for the Uno extensions templates. We'll give this one a name. So it's Uno app extension 01, and we'll go ahead and create that. And this time we're actually going to launch this in Visual Studio. So we're going to go and launch the solution file. Now, one thing you'll notice here is that the solution structure that we get with the extension template is a little bit more verbose. There's more things to it. Starting with the platforms folder, we can see these are familiar with what we saw in the VS Code example. So these are our various target platforms that are available. For the time being, I'm actually going to unload these first lot. Let's see my Solution Explorer for a second. So these first ones I'm actually going to unload. The reason being is that Visual Studios can be quite aggressive in terms of trying to restore and trying to build out these other platforms. So basically by unloading them, Visual Studio just will ignore them for the time being. That will just give us a little bit of extra performance as we navigate through our code. We will set the Windows project as our startup project. And whilst I'm talking through the rest of the solution structure, I'm actually going to kick off the build because it takes a couple of minutes. You'll see that some solution items. So basically, this just gives you a quick access for some of the build properties, and including the extensions props file, which basically is where we're referencing the Uno extensions. And so if you're going to upgrade them, then that's where you do those. So this is our running application. Unlike our Hello World example, it is actually made up of two pages, so we can navigate between them. You'll notice here that the styling on this button is actually a material style. So we've already brought in the material design language. Obviously, if you want to restyle it, you can either drop support for material and it will default back to the Fluent design, or you can bring in the Cupertino themes to make it look more like an iOS-based application. You'll notice at the top here, we've got a sort of a title for our page. As we navigate to the second page, you'll see that this actually changes to actually include a back button. And so this is actually the navigation bar that automatically handles or understands that there's a page on the back stack. So it'll actually show the back button when it needs to. And it provides a nice way to navigate forward and backwards between pages. Let me just stop the application and we'll continue on through the solution structure. Here we'll see that there's a couple of test projects. So there's a unit test project that allows us to test our view models and our service code. And then we have a UI testing project that allows us to run up our application, actually step through it and validate that the behavior of our application is how we expect it to be. The final two projects is basically a class library. So this is where we would expect to see our view model, service code, model code, etc. Essentially, any code that you really want to be able to unit test should go there. And so it's code that's kind of independent of the UI technology that's going to be displaying it. And then finally, we've got our shared project. And essentially, this is where all of our visual code, so things like converters, behaviors, etc., would all go here, controls, pages, etc. And as we saw previously, we've got our app.xaml, which is sort of the entry point for our application. Under views, we've got our main page and second page. So those are the two pages of our application. And they have a corresponding view models up in our presentation code. And we'll come back to those in a second or two as we start to build out this application. Now, I'm going to make one little change before we go on, which is to actually add into here a reference to the community toolkit, the MVVM toolkit. There is a version 8 of this that's just been released, and so they've consolidated that. If you're looking for a basic implementation of things like iNotify property change and validation, stuff like that, or even messaging, I'd highly recommend looking at the community toolkit. They've done a lot of work to make sure it's really performant, and it uses a lot of code generation in the background to support that. Okay, so obviously our main page doesn't have a huge amount on it right now. It's just got a button. So let's actually go back to our Figma document. We're going to bring in a couple of designs. So we're basically going to bring this list of products forward. And we're going to then look at some product details as the 2 pages of our application. and we're going to sort of navigate between those and actually load some code in it. So to start with, we'll select on our product list page, and we're going to go to plugins and show the Uno platform plugin, like so. And we'll switch across to the play tab, and I'll refresh there. Now you think, okay, well, that's just reproducing what's on the screen in terms of the Figma design. But the thing to note here is that what's happened behind the scenes is that it's taken the Figma design, it's generated the XAML's been parsed, and then it's been the XAML has been executed in a running WebAssembly application. Okay, so this is live code. Now it's not going to do anything because it's not wired up functionally, but it is wired up to actual data. So all of these items is actually coming from our data source, which is basically just a JSON file here. So this is our running application. I mean, I can put focus in the text box, and it actually allows me to put input. So it is actually a running page as such. So this actually allows the designers to not just see to actually come up with a design. It actually allows them to see what it's going to look like as a running application. If we switch across to the XAML tab, and I'll just hit refresh to make sure I've got the latest code there. This is the XAML that powers that view. Okay, so it's the XAML that's been generated from the page, the design page. We go ahead and copy that, and let's come back to our code. We're actually just going to drop that straight into our page here. Okay, so the only change I've really got to make here is actually I've got to just import a namespace here, and then our code is good to go. So let's actually run that. Now, obviously, we haven't written any code to bring back products yet, but right now what we should see is an application that is running and is styled the way that it was in our Figma document. Okay, so we've got our tab bar, we've got our search box at the top, and obviously we're just missing a list of products. So let's solve that right now. Let's go to our main view model. Now, normally I drop these into a separate file, but this is essentially a JSON endpoint. Okay, so I'll come to the browser. So there's a site called Dummy JSON that we're going to take advantage of. It basically allows us to simulate a bunch of different sort of common scenarios or common JSON kind of requests. So essentially here we're going to be using the get all product endpoint, which is going to be something like that. So that's the URL that basically just retrieves a list of products that we can then display in our application. So here we basically see the interface that defines that endpoint. We are going to be using refit, and so we don't actually need to define all the classes, etc., that go with it for this particular endpoint. Those are going to be generated for as part of using refit. And so this defines a single method called /products, which coincides with the path in the URL that we're going to be requesting. The other thing we've got is obviously the response document that then defines how we're going to deserialize the JSON into .NET objects. Okay, so we're going to get started with this endpoint, and in our view model, we're going to essentially just consume that. So we're going to bring it in here as a dependency, like so. And then we're going to use that to essentially retrieve the list of products. And I'll just get Visual Studio to generate that method for me. We're just going to change the response here to an async task. And in here, we're basically going to go var response equals wait. Get product. Okay, so this is going to retrieve our list of products, and then we need to assign the response object to a property that's then going to be consumable from our XAML. So to do that, we're going to inherit from observable object, which is part of the community toolkit, which gives us our basic implementation for iNotify property change. Essentially, as we're updating our properties, it's going to bubble up a property change event that our data binding is then going to intercept and use that to refresh the property values that are being data bound in the UI. Okay, so we're going to do an observable property. Okay, so here we're going to take advantage of some of the code generation aspects that come with the community toolkit. So we're actually going to define a private variable, and it's going to be our list of products. So, and we're going to pull out items. I used the word items as opposed to products here, just because I know that in the XAML, that's what the data binding expression is set up as. Down here, we're going to then say items equals response.products. One thing to note here is that we're using the uppercase I on items. This is because behind the scenes, the community toolkit has jumped in and is generating a property from our private variable with the same name, but with an uppercase I. And so that's going to be the property that's defined. The property itself is actually has all of the code to generate the property changed event as we go ahead and update it. So what should happen here is we retrieve our product, it goes ahead and sets the items, which bubbles up that event. Now, from a view model perspective, we're all good to go. However, we haven't defined what this dependency is going to be or where it's going to come from. To do that, we go into our app.xaml host file here. And essentially, you can see that this is where we're essentially newing up various services for our application. Okay, so we have our host builder, and we're configuring various aspects here. So here we're going to basically add in our refit service. I've got a bunch of namespaces I need to bring in. And just while we're here, I'm actually going to disable the reactive side of things for the time being, just because we're using the community toolkit instead. So this basically is going to define our the service that we want. So basically, it gets refit to kick in and basically generate the service we want. However, the one thing it's not defining is the actual endpoint that we're going to be calling. So the URL that we're going to be calling. For that, we're actually going to drop into our settings file, and we're just going to provide a URL here. And automatically, this gets wired up. Basically, at runtime, the settings file gets retrieved and mapped through to our refit service. So now we should be good to go. We can hit play, and hopefully we should be bringing back our list of products. Okay, so we have a list of products, and we can see here that it's binding to a couple of things. We're not actually seeing our photos, so let's go and see whether we can just fix that. We're going to go into our main page, just come down here, and there's just a minor issue in terms of the path here. So we're going to change that to photo 01, and we'll give that a quick run and see whether the updates are and gives us a list of photos. Okay, and then we have our images associated with each of the items. Now, what would really be good is when we click on these items, we are navigated to our second page where we can see the details. To do that, we actually need to tell it where to navigate to. So we're going to add in a navigation request in here, and we're going to define it and say, go to the second page. Okay, but where's this second or this route defined? That's defined in our app.xaml down here. You'll see that we've got these registered routes. And so down here, we've got our second route that's associated with our second view model. And we've got a pairing up here between our second view model and the second page. Now, we're actually going to change that to be a data map. And we're going to tell it that the second view model should expect an object of type product. Now, clearly, our second view model, if we go to there, currently does not expect a product to be passed to it. So we're going to actually change that to be this view model to be a record, and we're going to pass it in a product as part of its constructor. Remembering that with a record, the constructor parameter also becomes a property. So we're actually going to be exposing a product property here that we can then data bind to. Okay, so that sorts our view model out. Obviously, we need to update our second page view because right now we've got no way of displaying that item. So let's just jump back to Figma for a second. We're going to click on product details. So that's this page over here. We're going to refresh our XAML page. A second, and we're going to copy that. And then we'll come back to our code and drop that into our page. And I'll just scroll up here because I know there's a couple of things that were broken by default. So for example, I haven't imported the package for the ratings control. And again, we need to bring in the namespace here. The other thing we need to do is we need to make sure we data binding to that product object as opposed to the moment where it's not. It's basically assuming that they're going to be properties that are exposed on the view model. So we're going to change the data context here to binding product. Okay, so as we scroll down, we should see that things like the name and the branding and stuff should be correct. Remembering we've actually got a thing called photos, so we're actually going to bind to the first photo in that list. And there we should be good to go. So let's give that a quick run, and hopefully we should have product details that display. Okay, so there's our list of products. We click on those, and we have our product details presented in a sort of more vertical panel. Now, obviously, this is running on Windows. Let's just have a see if we can then run this on other platforms. So let's actually stop that. I'm going to go and pick our mobile one and reload that. We'll set that as our startup project, and we'll go ahead and run it on our Android emulator. Okay, so for those who haven't worked with the Net6 single project, this drop down here basically allows you to pick from the various target platforms, so whether it be iOS and Android, and then the target device. So for iOS and Android, they both have options for simulators or emulators, and then there's the real devices. So if you have a real iOS device plugged into your Mac, you can deploy and run to that, and obviously the same for Android if you've got one plugged in. Let's actually see that's going to output. This is our running emulator. It does take a while or two to do the build and then actually push out the application to the device, which we'll see in a second or two. As I mentioned before, it is a single platform, so a single project for multiple platforms. So you'll see here that for the first time we go ahead and build it, it will actually build for the various platforms. Once you've done the first build, subsequent builds are much quicker because it only builds for the platform that you're actually deploying and debugging to. Unless you do a full rebuild, in which case it will build all of the platforms. Okay, so we'll just give it a second to deploy. And we should see our application new up shortly. Okay, so here's our list of products coming. He says, and then we can click through our product and view the details of our product like so. So basically the same code running on multiple platforms. Okay, so going back to the slides for a second, yeah, we've already talked about the VS Code integration. So as I was typing in both XAML and C#, you do get Intellisense. You also get the XAML and C# hot reload. So it is quite a productive environment to actually build out your application with. In terms of customers that are using the Uno platform, there's actually quite a wide array of both enterprise and consumer-facing customers. Trade Zero, for example, is a very consumer-focused, high-fidelity kind of application, and they've got a multi-year strategy for building across all platforms. The Nougat Packet Explorer, if you haven't been to Nougat recently, you're obviously not working in the developer space. Let me just bring up Nougat for a second. Here, let's actually switch to here. And so if I bring up Nougat and just find a package, so we'll do extensions configuration. And so when we click through to the details of this, you'll see over on the right-hand side, we have open in the Nougat Package Explorer. If I click on that, it actually runs an Uno platform WebAssembly application, and it's going to download that package and interrogate it within the confines of the browser, right? So it's actually going to expand out and actually have a look at the contents of that. You can click on the package information and see them. Let's click on the right thing, the view metadata source at the top, so you can actually see the metadata associated with the package, and you can see the various contents of the package. So you can click on things like images and explore it, etc. So that's quite a useful tool, all built with the Uno platform, based off an original Windows-based application. Next, we have Kahua, which is basically quite a large WPF-based application that are now using the Uno platform to bring to the web, using the WebAssembly model. We've got the Uno calculator. So this is the original Windows calculator. So the same source code as basically in the 90s has been brought forward and is now available across all of the supported Uno platform target heads. In summary, so the sort of the WinUI ecosystem, basically the Uno platform allows you to take that and bring it to every other platform that runs .NET. It includes web support, so basically a full debugging experience for building out a WebAssembly application. The design is designed to be pixel perfect across the various target platforms as opposed to the platform specific controls. And as we move forward into the sort of the Uno platform, the support for things like Figma and the VS Code integration, etc., all make it a very productive environment to work with. If you want to engage with the Uno platform, the best place to start is platform.uno. This provides links to documentation, getting started, samples, templates, etc. Once you get started, if you want to reach out to the team, they are readily available on Discord. They do monitor Stack Overflow as well for the sort of more Q&A style stuff. And then if you do need to raise issues on any of the components of the platform, whether it be Uno, the toolkit, extensions, etc., those are all available via the GitHub repository. And of course, if you need to get hold of me, feel free to reach out on Twitter, email, etc. I'm nearly always available to take questions. And of course, open the floor to questions now. So thanks very much for listening, and yeah, I'll stick around and ask some questions if people got them.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Nick. I was actually just over here going back to see how long it's been since we had a session on Uno, and it was, well, what feels like a long time ago, April 21, so April of last year, and it already feels like there's, a million new exciting things added to the platform since even like a little over a year ago. So that's pretty awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, look, I mean, the team's always looking at making sure that we're working across the full set of the .NET sort of target platforms. The switch to Net 6 and WinUI has been a fairly substantial change, and one that will only improve over time as we sort of fall into sync with the release cycles of the .NET team. So.
Cool. And one of the things that really jumped out to me, and also, as Nick mentioned, if anyone else has questions, definitely get those into the chat or into the Q&A, but I'm happy to seed some and buy some time for folks to enter anything that's on their mind. But like the Figma integration that you were showing there is just incredibly powerful. I think it's, as you were mentioning, I think there's just been that massive void between, what's easy to do on a design side and, what it takes to actually implement things and animations and like all the things that make UI and UX really nice. So seeing that gap start to close is hugely exciting. I guess one of the things that it got me wondering was like, is there any sort of like developer tool chain things that a designer would need to be running on their machine to be able to do whatever it's doing behind the scenes, or is it more self-contained from a designer perspective, like it all just clicks and works?
Yeah, it's all designed to be very self-contained within the world of Figma. So literally the only things they need to do is grab that component library, which is basically just a Figma file. And actually that's really just to make sure that they're using controls that are going to generate XAML well. And then the Figma plugin. And actually the designers really don't need to do that unless if they don't want to see what it looks like as a running application. We do encourage that because sometimes there will be some discrepancies on, when it's generating XAML and then what the XAML looks like in the running app. So definitely from a design perspective, it's good for them to double check that. But then the main users of that plugin will be developers that are then needing to take the XAML and export it and actually put it into their running source code. And so, yeah, we're definitely conscious of trying to solve or trying to bridge that gap. I mean, there's a lot of people asking for sort of WinUI based designers and things like that. Microsoft's invested very heavily in the past in sort of visual designers, whether it be for sort of WPF or UWP. And the reality is that they very rarely see the return on them. Developers don't spend much time in them because once they're familiar with XAML, they find it quicker to write their own XAML than they do for most scenarios. The only difference, or the only ones that I would put a caveat on that, I think is like when you're doing animations and storyboards and stuff like that. Blend was absolutely invaluable for doing that type of thing because nobody can remember what an animation code should look like in XAML. So there's definitely some call outs for where it is suitable for having that type of capability. But the majority of static design, it's quicker for people to write XAML. And the reality is that designers were never using those tools. And so there wasn't really a market for visual designers as much as people say that they want to have a visual designer. So we see that basically starting with Figma and basically allowing to code gen a lot of the XAML is definitely a step in the right direction for supporting that handoff between designers and developers.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And meeting designers where they are instead of trying to force them into other sets of tools and ecosystems that they're not really looking for. I think it's pretty exciting to see. I guess what's next for Uno? I mean, obviously we've covered all sorts of stuff that wasn't even there, like I said, a little over a year ago. But like, what's on the radar for next steps for the platform?
Yeah, so definitely a big investment at the moment is around Figma and sort of iterating that. I think that there is still some stabilization to be done around Net6 and Visual Studio. So a lot of times being sunk into making sure that with every update for the previews that comes out, that that the Uno platform is working as productively as we can. So there's a utility called Uno Check that's designed to basically make sure that your environment set up with the right workloads, etc., to build Uno applications. And so there's a lot of work and investment going into that because the Net6 mobile team are still trying to stabilize their platform and the tooling around their platform, I should say. So they GA'd not with the original Net6, so back in November last year. They actually GA'd a build this year with the release of Maui. So that's all of the Net6 mobile, so iOS, Android, macOS, and Catalyst. So Net6 for those platforms kind of GA'd earlier this year. And the tooling basically has been a bit of a shambles along the way because it's very late to the program. They are looking at stabilizing and getting out a stable release this month is, I think, where they're targeting for that. And so once that happens, I think that the focus of the Uno team on trying to stabilize and trying to provide support for that can move on, and we can basically focus on other things. I think that there's a lot of work around supporting WinUI as a concept. So the WinUI team are very conscious that they're looking at supporting things like XAML islands, or I think they're calling them content islands, which essentially allows you to build a sort of a WPF app that allows you to then have a WinUI app running inside it for various screens or individual controls. The Uno team have got a similar concept around content islands. So essentially with your existing WPF app, you can actually drop in an Uno platform control or page that allows you to then build out parts of your application. And this is to support the overall strategy of being able to take a somewhat legacy application and have it available across all of the Uno targets. So you may want to sort of upport or bring forward certain parts of your application that make sense to have on iOS and Android and Windows by leveraging this concept of sort of content islands. So yeah, definitely plenty of things for us to work on, and not the least of which is the extensions, which is close to my heart, given that's what I'm spending most of my time on at the moment. So this is basically a sort of a better abstraction for navigation and reactive code and stuff like that. So but we could devote an entire session on doing those type of things. So.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there's plenty of good stuff in the works, and I guess we'll just have to have you back, some months down the line to keep talking through what you're all working on.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely love that.
Cool. I think that covers it for questions, unless anything comes in while I'm rambling our way out of here, I guess. But I just want to say huge thanks again to Nick for coming in and delivering this content. Like I said, it feels long overdue, even if it wasn't calendar time that long since we covered a lot of this stuff. So really awesome to see a lot of the progress there. Thanks as always to everyone for showing up and hanging out and being interested in doing these sorts of things, whether you are local here in Los Angeles or on the other side of the world. The recording for this will be up on our YouTube channel sometime this week. We'll aim for. We'll post out the link in all the normal places, Twitter and Meetup and all that sort of stuff. And keep an eye out for new meetings coming down the schedule. We've got the one on the calendar for September, and working on getting October and beyond in perpetuity filled out. So some more awesome stuff to come soon. But thanks again. In the meantime, hope everyone has a great night, great month. Stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Have a great night, folks.
Thanks, everyone.